Thank you, Brendan. That was such a nice introduction. I'll send you a check. And thank you, Joe, for inviting me. I think in terms of the relationship between Britain and the European Union, and of course the effect on us, we're in a time of great uncertainty and a time of great unpredictability. But I think we should at least welcome the clear outcome to the British election, because it means that we now are going to have a referendum in the United Kingdom about British continued membership of the EU or not. The question needs to be answered. It needs to be answered sooner rather than later. And I, for one, welcome the fact that there is now going to be a referendum in the United Kingdom to determine this relationship one way or the other. I just want to say a few words in three particular areas. I want to say something about the United Kingdom itself, and about why I think what they want and why I think they want it. Secondly, I want to say something about our own interests, Irish interests, the interests of my own country. I won't go into that in very great detail because there's a lot of it in the book, and by the way, you can get the book for nothing. If you go onto the website of the Institute for International and European Affairs, you can read it there, or you can even download it, and we encourage you to do so. And then thirdly, I want to just raise a few questions as to, against the background of what's likely to happen in Britain and what's likely to happen to Irish interests, what we as a country should try to do between now and the referendum. And God between us and all harm, what should we do if the British withdraw? The polls in the UK consistently say that there's roughly half and half, give a poll, take a poll. There's roughly half and half in the United Kingdom for continued membership of the EU, or who would prefer to get out, as it is at the moment. The polls also say that were Prime Minister Cameron to have a successful renegotiation and to change, as it were, the conditions of the British relationship with the EU, then you might get a majority in a referendum. Who knows? We just don't know. I think we have to ask ourselves, what has been happening in Britain that has brought them to this stage? Now, it's not that the British are, in essence, particularly different to the rest of us. I think it is true that the relationship with the European Union has been of a slightly different nature to the relationship of many other countries. I mean, it's persistent over the years that there seems to be less commitment in the UK to the European project, as it was, than there might have been, say, countries like France or countries like Germany, or indeed countries like ours. But many of the difficulties that they have, many of the problems that they see are ones that are shared. For example, there's no doubt that there has been a rise throughout the European Union, and certainly in the older member states of the European Union, there has been a rise in what, for simple terms, I call nationalism. There's been a rise in a feeling that there's too much regulation coming from Brussels, that the problems which we have can probably be better resolved a little bit closer to home. Now, that's very true in Britain, but it's equally true in other countries. If you look at France, for example, if you look at Italy, Spain, Denmark, Finland, Sweden, there has been a rise in nationalism. Look at our own country. There is on the left in this country and on the right members of Parliament, members of the Oireachtas, who are quite sceptical about Irish membership. Indeed, there are members, particularly on the left, who are quite sceptical about the very nature of politics. Some of them describe themselves not as politicians, but as political activists. So there are very, very serious changes taking place. And not to mention the party that we have in this country called Sinn Féin, which is very definitely a strong nationalist party with very strong doubts about the link with Europe. So there has been this rise in nationalism throughout Europe, and it's in Britain as it is elsewhere. But I think there's something slightly additional in England. I think there's something cultural about it. I think there's something historical about it. And frankly, although it's not admitted, I think there's something deeply emotional about it. I think there really is a very deep commitment to England, which is rising in the UK in a way that we haven't seen before. You see it, for example, in the use of the English flag, the St. George's Cross. I remember being very struck in Chequers. There's a little plaque in Chequers, which was presented to the British Prime Minister after the First World War. And it was in memory of the war. And it was in order to provide a respite where the Prime Minister could spend a weekend or a few days off. And the little plaque says that it was presented because of the sacrifice made by England in the First World War, in the Great War. I was very struck by it. It wasn't the sacrifice made by the United Kingdom or the sacrifice made by the English and Scots and Welsh and indeed Irish in the Great War. It was the sacrifice made by the English. So there is a bit, I think, of English emotionalism. I mean, we know all about Irish emotionalism. We don't have to be told about it. But there is a bit of English emotionalism, and I think it's rising. Now, the issues which appear to be giving difficulty are immigration, the treatment of immigrants. I've heard it said, by the way, that the problem is not necessarily the treatment of the current immigrants, but of the last wave of immigration. I don't know whether that's true or not. There's the whole question of regulation from outside. This is particularly felt in the city. There's the issue of the relationship between the countries within the Eurozone and the countries without the Eurozone. And then there's the very fundamental question of sovereignty. Where, ultimately, should the decisions be made which affect our daily lives? If you're living in Donegal, should they be made in Donegal? Should they be made in Dublin? Should they be made in Brussels? And this is very, very deep in the United Kingdom. It's the question of sovereignty in Westminster. And you have this dual sort of difficulty in Westminster. You have the question of a reduction in sovereignty, as it were, which goes to Brussels and to Strasbourg and to the European Parliament and so on. And then you've also got the whole question, and I'm sure you'll hear about this later, of devolution, the internal sovereignty of Westminster over the constituent nations of the United Kingdom. Now, I think if those are the issues, I think the Prime Minister can get a deal. I think a deal is available. I think people want the United Kingdom to remain in the European Union. I think people believe that the European Union would be much better off if the United Kingdom remained in. So I think a deal is available. I'm afraid what I'm increasingly convinced of is that I'm not sure, or I'm becoming less sure, let me say, that if he gets a deal, he can actually sell it. Now, the opinion polls at the moment certainly indicate that if he gets a deal, he can sell it. But I'm not so sure. I think this sense of Englishness is very deeply rooted. And I think it's very understandable. And I think we should understand, given our own sense of Irishness, we should understand what it means. The British press on the whole are very anti-European. And they are much more politically driven than the press in Ireland. If you read the British press, for example, they talk about all these problems in banking that you have in the Eurozone and all of this. They make no reference to the fact that some of the first and the biggest banking problems in Europe actually happened in a country outside the euro area. They happened in the United Kingdom. First bank to go was Northern Rock. And then you had the Royal Bank of Scotland. And then you had Lloyds. Huge banking problems in the UK. But if you read the press, it's as if all the problem is in the European area. There seems to be the old scepticism coming back into the trade unions, and the old scepticism coming back into parts of the Labour Party. Don't forget, when they had the referendum 40 years ago, the people who were most vociferously against continued British membership of the then EEC were elements within the Labour Party. And I think all of this is coming back to the surface. So I'm not personally convinced, I hope I'm wrong by the way, but I'm not personally convinced that a referendum can actually be carried in the United Kingdom. And that the words that Prime Minister Cameron used in an interview with the Financial Times 4, 5, 6 months ago, that Britain might sleepwalk out of the European Union, he may well prove to be correct. Now, what are our interests? What should we do? I'm not going to, the book is there, you can get it on the web. There are, frankly, over 100 pages which argue why being in the European Union is good for us. Any one of us, and there are many of us in this room who are more or less the same age as myself, we know what it was like before we joined the European Union. I do not want to go back there. I don't want to live in the Ireland in which I was brought up. I want my children and my grandchildren to live in the sort of Ireland that I live in now. And that was achieved through membership of the European Union. And it was achieved through being able to build up at last within the European Union a reasonable, decent, trustworthy, respectful relationship between the governments in London and the government in Dublin. And I really don't want to, so I'm not going to go into all the detail, but I think it is absolutely clear and absolutely certain that we have benefited hugely from membership of the European Union and that it's in our interests to stay in. So what I'm going to say and ask just a few questions is what might happen to those interests? Whether to be a vote in the UK, which ended up in the UK leaving the European Union, what would then happen to us? What of our interests would be affected? Well, firstly, look at trade. There's over €1 billion of trade done between Britain and Ireland every week. And an enormous amount of that trade is in the supply chain. We supply a bit for a product that's put together in Birmingham, or we supply a bit for a product that's put together in Belfast, and vice versa. And that trade takes place every day, every week. 1 billion a week. You see all the Eddie Stobart trucks on the road. What are they carrying? They're carrying British produce for sale in supermarkets in Ireland and Irish produce for sale in supermarkets in Britain. That would all be affected. Britain is still a huge market for our agriculture. Now, there's been a long history in Britain of cheap food. I'm not saying this would happen, but were Britain to pull out of the Union, there would very definitely be a temptation to open the British market to cheaper, less regulated, and certainly from a health point of view, less satisfactory produce from places like Latin America. What would be the effect on, for example, the export of Irish beef? One supermarket chain in the UK takes 50% of our beef exports to the United Kingdom. One supermarket, Tesco's. Energy. We've been trying to build up cross-border energy markets, European energy markets, in order to reduce the costs of energy throughout the island. This has been effective There's a cross-border energy market between the north and the south. There are interconnections between Ireland and Scotland. And there should be more. If Britain pulls out, there will most certainly be an effect on the energy market. What about things like investment? Some people say, by the way, that it might be of advantage to us were the British to pull out. And it's certainly been stated by some of the banks in the City of London that were Britain to pull out, they would be tempted to move some of their operations to our financial services in Dublin. But a real area of concern, for me anyway, is the whole area of cooperation in judicial affairs, in legal matters, and between the police. Shortly after Mr Cameron came into power, the first occasion, they decided to exercise their right to withdraw from all sorts of arrangements on a European basis in legal affairs and in policing affairs. And we Irish got very frightened indeed. In fact, Brendan and I went off to London to speak to people, as did the government. I remember what it was like in this country when we could not extradite, for political reasons, people from the south, either to the north or to Britain, for crimes, very, very serious crimes that were committed, or vice versa. There was no extradition. Nowadays, under the European arrest warrant, it happens willy-nilly. It's just, you write a piece of paper. Were Britain to pull out of the EU, that would all be raised again. All of these issues would be back on the table. The whole question of police cooperation in areas like Europol, Eurojust, would come into question. And finally, and I think really, for me anyway, the most important, is the whole question of the relationship between the two governments and Northern Ireland. The peace that exists in Northern Ireland, and the fact that you can now drive across that border from Donegal to Enniskillen as if it didn't exist, that was brought about by the two governments. They drove a peace process. I was present at many of those meetings. I know what they were like. They were incredibly difficult. And the two governments together created circumstances which allowed the different traditions in Northern Ireland, the different political traditions in Northern Ireland, enabled them to work together. It's very fragile. It's going to require at least 2 generations of very, very careful husbanding by the two governments. That must not be put at risk. And I really fear greatly that if there's a British exit, it will be put at risk. So I think from what you've heard me say, I would very strongly prefer if the United Kingdom remains within the European Union. So what should we do? What should we do to help them? What should we do to try and keep them in? I think firstly, we should try to look at what reforms we ourselves want to see in the European Union. There's no question but that the European Union needs reform. Every organisation needs reform as it goes on. And the President of the European Commission has put a former very senior Dutch politician, Timmermans, in charge of the reform, in charge of reducing regulation so that there can be a better EU. He's also put the British Commissioner, Hill, in charge of trying to create a European capital market, which would be enormously helpful to, for example, small businesses in accessing money to set up small businesses. We should look at these reforms and we should try and encourage these reforms. And we should make sure that the British concern for reform, that's all part of this, so that the British renegotiation becomes a European renegotiation. And that would make it much, much easier for European governments to make the necessary concessions to the United Kingdom government. Secondly, I think we know the English much better than anybody else in Europe. I'm not saying we know them very well, but I think we know them a lot better. And frequently in the past, the Irish government has been of help to, for example, interpreting British views with the French or with the Germans or whoever it might be. And I think we should continue to try and get the Europeans to understand. I think we need to accept British exceptionalism. We need to accept that they're never going to join the euro, that they're never going to join Schengen, that they don't want to be part of this ever closer union of the peoples of Europe. We should accept that. And we should cut a deal which makes it quite clear that they're not committed to any of that, and which enables the rest of us to move on. And that the deal should be such that it would hold for the foreseeable future. However, we also need to bring home to the British in London the consequences for them, the consequences for the United Kingdom of a possible significant deterioration in the relationship with the member states of the European Union. And we need to bring home to them the possible difficulties which could arise in British-Irish relations were they to pull out and we to remain in, of the kind which I've just mentioned. Problems will arise in the legal area, in the policing area, in the economic area, which will affect both of us. They need to be aware, or they need to be made aware, of consequences of which they're not thinking. It's very noticeable when you go to London how people in London think of this issue as something affecting them towards the south and towards the east. They don't necessarily have on their minds the consequences which might exist for Scotland, for example, or for Liverpool, or for Manchester. And they certainly don't think very much of the consequences which might exist for Dublin. Finally, I do think we need to think in Ireland of a plan B. What happens if they do exit? What are we going to do? Because I think if the United Kingdom exits the European Union, I think there is a serious possibility that the United Kingdom will break up. And I think the consequences of that for Northern Ireland and for the relationship between North and South and for the relationship between Dublin and London are really enormous. So I leave it there. Thank you.